There's an ancient Egyptian saying that a teacher wrote down for his students more than 3,000 years ago. It went something like this: a boy's ear is on his back. He listens only when he is beaten. Let that sink in. That wasn't a threat scrawled by a cruel man in secret. That was educational philosophy, official policy. A respected teacher writing down, for the next generation of teachers, the core principle of Egyptian schooling. Children don't learn through encouragement. They learn through the stick. Welcome to ancient Egyptian school, where the homework was carved into rock, the punishment was a beating, the dropout rate was basically the entire country, and the reward for surviving it was the most powerful job a commoner could ever dream of. Because here's the thing that makes Egyptian education so fascinating. Almost nobody got to go. In a nation of millions, only a tiny sliver of children ever sat in a classroom. School wasn't a right. It wasn't even really for kids in general. It was a golden ticket, a narrow, brutal, ink-stained path to power. And the kids who walked it were chasing one specific, glittering prize. So who actually went to school in ancient Egypt? What did they learn? Why was the writing so insanely hard? And what was that one job worth suffering years of beatings for? Let's open the world's oldest classroom. First, the big picture, and it's a stark one. The overwhelming majority of ancient Egyptians never went to school at all and never learned to read or write. Estimates vary, but the literacy rate may have been as low as 1% of the population, maybe a little more. 1%. Picture your entire town, and only a handful of people in it can read a single word. For everyone else, education wasn't a school, it was an apprenticeship. If your father was a farmer, you learned to farm by farming. If he was a baker, a potter, a weaver, a builder, you learned at his side by doing it from the time you were small. The vast majority of Egyptian education was just kids learning the family trade in the field or the workshop. No desks, no lessons, just work, watch, repeat. And for girls, formal schooling was rarer still. Most learned the running of a household, cooking, weaving, childcare, and family skills at home. Though some women, especially of higher status, clearly could read and write. But for a small, lucky, ambitious few, mostly boys, mostly from families that already had some status, there was something more. There was the chance to become a scribe. And to understand Egyptian school, you have to understand why being a scribe was such an enormous deal. In a society where almost no one could read or write, the person who could was magic. Writing ran everything: tax records, contracts, letters, religious texts, royal decrees, inventories of grain, the accounts of entire temples and armies. All of it depended on scribes. Nothing moved in Egypt without someone writing it down. The scribe was the spreadsheet, the lawyer, the accountant, the secretary, and the historian of the ancient world, all rolled into one. They were exempt from manual labor and heavy taxes. They didn't get drafted to haul stone or dig canals. They worked in the shade, with clean hands, holding a pen instead of a hoe. They could rise to advise governors, priests, even the pharaoh himself. In other words, becoming a scribe was the single greatest act of upward mobility available in the entire civilization. It was the ancient Egyptian dream. Escape the mud, the heat, and the back-breaking labor, and join the lettered elite. And the doorway to that dream was school. So let's step inside. School often took place in what was called the House of Life, a kind of institution attached to temples, part library, part scriptorium, part university, where sacred and practical texts were copied, studied, and taught. Younger boys might also be taught in groups by a working scribe, sometimes in a courtyard or a designated room, sometimes even at the workplace where they'd one day be employed. Boys typically started young, around 5 or so, and the training could go on for years and years. This was not a quick certificate. Becoming a fully trained scribe could take a decade or more of grinding study. And what did that study actually look like? In a word, copying. Endless, relentless copying. There were no fun activities, no group projects, no show and tell. Egyptian education was built on one method above all: repetition and memorization. Students copied texts over and over and over, by hand, until the words and signs were burned into their memory. They copied famous works of literature, wise sayings, model letters, religious hymns, and practical exercises. They recited out loud, in unison, droning the lessons back to the teacher again and again. The philosophy was simple and merciless. Do it 1,000 times, and you will never forget it. Learning by heart was the entire game. But here's a practical problem the Egyptians had to solve, and their solution is genuinely clever, and it's the reason we know so much about their schools today. Papyrus, the proper writing material, was expensive. You do not hand expensive paper to a clumsy 7-year-old who's going to misspell everything. So students practiced on the cheapest writing surface available: ostraca. These were broken bits of pottery and flat flakes of limestone. Basically, garbage. Trash. The Egyptian equivalent of scrap paper. A student would grab a pottery shard, practice his signs and his sentences on it in ink, and when it was full, toss it aside. And because they were tossed aside by the thousands, they survived. Archaeologists have dug up huge numbers of these student practice pieces, and they are a window straight into the ancient classroom. We have the actual homework of children who lived 3,000 years ago. We have their wobbly first attempts at hieroglyphs. We have corrections, where a teacher went over the students' work in red ink and fixed the mistakes. Yes, teachers' marking in red pen is over 3,000 years old. Your teacher's red pen is a genuine ancient tradition. We have lines written out over and over for practice. We even have a few where you can practically feel the boredom radiating off the shard. Real kids, real handwriting, real struggle, preserved in the sand. Now, about that writing, because this is a huge part of why school was so brutal. Egyptian writing was monstrously difficult to learn. The hieroglyphic script had hundreds upon hundreds of distinct signs, some standing for sounds, some for whole words, some for ideas, some just there to clarify meaning. And then, on top of full hieroglyphs, there was a faster, cursive everyday script called hieratic that scribes used for daily business, which the students also had to master. So you weren't learning 26 letters. You were memorizing hundreds of complex symbols and multiple writing systems. It was less like learning the alphabet and more like learning thousands of tiny, intricate drawings, each with its own rules. No wonder it took 10 years. No wonder only 1% pulled it off. And if you struggled? If you got distracted or lazy or just had a bad day? Well, remember the ear on the back. Egyptian schooling was harsh, and discipline was physical. Beatings were a normal, expected part of education. Teachers genuinely believed that pain was the path to knowledge, that a boy had to be physically corrected to stay on track. We have texts where teachers basically brag about it and remind students that they were beaten into shape for their own good. There are even references suggesting that unruly or truant students could be confined, essentially put in a kind of detention or lockup to keep them focused. One text has a teacher scolding a student for skipping lessons to wander around drinking and having fun, lecturing him that he's throwing away his future. Some things about being a teenager, it seems, are eternal. But the teachers had a secret weapon that was more powerful than any stick: propaganda. Brilliant, relentless, motivational propaganda. There's a famous Egyptian text used in schools that scholars call the Satire of the Trades. And it is, essentially, the world's oldest stay-in-school lecture, disguised as a tour of every other job in Egypt, designed to terrify a boy into loving his studies. In it, a father is taking his son to scribal school, and along the way he describes, in vivid and hilarious detail, just how miserable every other profession is. The blacksmith? His fingers are like crocodile skin, and he stinks worse than fish eggs. The potter is covered in dirt, grubbing in the mud like a pig. The farmer is exhausted, eaten alive by insects, taxed into the ground. The fisherman works among crocodiles that might eat him. The bricklayer's arms are destroyed, his clothes are stiff with filth. The barber wanders the streets until his arms ache just trying to find a customer. Job after job, the message hammers home. Every other path in life is dirty, painful, dangerous, and poor. And then comes the pitch. But the scribe? The scribe is the boss. The scribe directs the work of everyone else and does none of the suffering himself. Be a scribe, the text urges. It saves you from labor and protects you from all work. It puts you in a position to give orders. It is a job advertisement, 3,000 years old, and it works exactly like a modern one. Paint every alternative as a nightmare, then offer the dream. Generations of Egyptian boys read that, looked at their aching, mud-caked fathers and uncles, and thought, yeah, I'll take the pen, thanks. So picture the whole journey. You're one of the rare few. At 5 years old, you start. For 10 years, you sit and copy symbols onto broken pottery, droning lessons out loud, getting smacked when you slip, memorizing hundreds of signs across 2 writing systems, while a teacher reminds you daily that the alternative is a life of crocodiles and mud. And if you make it, if you survive the decade, you graduate into the lettered elite. You get the clean hands, the shade, the respect, the exemption from labor, and a path that could carry you all the way to the palace. Now strip it all back and look at what it really was. It was the first great education system in human history. And buried inside all the beatings and the broken pottery is something we'd recognize instantly. Kids dreading school. Endless repetition and rote memorization. Practice work scribbled on scrap and thrown away. Teachers correcting mistakes in red ink. Students skipping class to go have fun and getting lectured about their futures. The constant, anxious promise that if you just study hard enough, you'll escape a worse life and rise above where you started. The idea that education is the ladder, the one real way up. We didn't invent any of that. The Egyptians were running it in mud brick rooms by the Nile 3,000 years ago. They figured out before almost anyone that knowledge is power. Literally, that the person who can read and write controls the person who can't. And they built a brutal, brilliant machine to produce exactly enough of those people to run an empire, and no more. The next time you complain about homework or sit through a lesson you'd rather skip, just be grateful for 2 small mercies the Egyptian schoolboy never had. Your paper isn't a piece of garbage off the floor, and your teacher, hopefully, has put down the stick.